Previously, we uncovered the rise of the papacy, from its earliest days under Roman persecution to the dramatic power struggles that shook empires. But the story doesn't end there. In part 2, the stakes get even higher. We'll witness how the Crusades redefined the Church's role in global politics, how popes challenged kings and were challenged in return, and how moments of corruption, reform, and resilience shaped the very soul of Catholicism. This is the age of exiles, emperors, and epic confrontations. This is the continuation of a story that's far from over. Let's begin. Gelasius II was unanimously elected pope, but his reign was marked by conflict. He spent much of his papacy in exile after clashing with Emperor Henry V, who installed anti-pope Gregory VIII in his place. Protected by the Normans, Gelasius excommunicated both the emperor and the anti-pope before dying in exile. Calixtus II, already a powerful nobleman, succeeded him and continued the confrontation with Henry V. He too excommunicated the emperor and had anti-pope Gregory imprisoned. In response to the violence against Jews during the Crusades, Calixtus strictly forbade Christians from harming Jewish communities. He also presided over the First Lateran Council, which, among other reforms, officially banned clerical marriage, a practice that had previously only been discouraged. Honorius II rose to the papacy by force after the rival candidate, Celestine II, was unanimously elected. Honorius launched a violent attack that wounded Celestine, leading to his resignation. During his papacy, Honorius became the first pope to formally confirm the election of a Holy Roman Emperor, Lothair III, and granted official recognition to the crusading military order known as the Knights Templar. Innocent II was elected swiftly, but immediately faced opposition from anti-pope Anacletus II, who held enough influence to seize control of Rome. Innocent was forced to flee and gained support from Emperor Lothair, whom he later crowned. Despite 2 failed attempts to reclaim Rome, Anacletus's death eventually allowed Innocent to return and resume full authority. He officially endorsed the Knights Templars' role in the Crusades. Celestine II served as pope for only 5 months, yet still managed to intervene in the political affairs of Rome, England, and France. He also strengthened the influence of the Knights Templar during his short time in office. Lucius II became entangled in the politics of England and Portugal, but his greatest challenge came from within Rome itself. Facing a rebellion that aimed to strip the papacy of secular control over the city, Lucius personally led an armed response. He was fatally struck by a stone in battle, becoming one of the few popes to die from battlefield injuries. Eugene III accepted the papacy at a time when few wanted the role. Unable to reside in Rome, he reigned in exile. After the Muslim reconquest of Edessa, he launched the Second Crusade, the first of many failed attempts to reclaim lost territory in the Holy Land. Anastasius IV ruled for a year and a half, and is mainly remembered for mediating a long-standing dispute with Holy Roman Emperor Frederick over the appointment of an archbishop. Adrian IV holds the distinction of being the only English pope in history. He restored papal authority in Rome, but found himself at odds with Emperor Frederick I. However, his relations with England were strong. Most notably, he gave King Henry II of England the papal blessing to invade Ireland. Alexander III reigned for nearly 22 years, one of the longest pontificates in church history. His rule was challenged by 4 rival anti-popes, all backed by Emperor Frederick and dissenting cardinals, forcing Alexander to spend much of his reign outside Rome. After securing his position, he rejected Byzantine efforts to heal the East-West Schism, authorized the Northern Crusades, and convened the Third Lateran Council, one of the most influential church synods of the medieval period. Lucius III, a former papal diplomat, spent most of his papacy in exile due to internal Roman unrest. His tenure was marked by ongoing conflict with Emperor Frederick, and he died while preparing for the launch of the Third Crusade. Urban III continued the church's long-running feud with Emperor Frederick, this time over territories in Tuscany. He refused to crown Frederick's son Henry as King of Italy. Urban also helped broker a 2-year truce between England and France. However, he died shortly after receiving word of devastating Christian defeats in the Holy Land, reportedly from the shock and grief. Gregory VIII served as pope for only 2 months, but made a notable effort to mend relations with the Holy Roman Empire. Before his death from fever, he officially declared the start of the Third Crusade. Clement III ended nearly 50 years of tension between the papacy and the city of Rome, finally allowing the pope to return and reside there. He also persuaded the kings of England and France to participate in the Third Crusade. Celestine III, the third pope from the powerful Orsini family, crowned Henry VI as Holy Roman Emperor. However, he later threatened to excommunicate him for imprisoning King Richard I of England. Wishing to resign due to old age, Celestine was prevented by the cardinals and died shortly after. Innocent III became one of the most dominant and politically influential popes of the medieval period. Through the Fourth Lateran Council, he implemented sweeping reforms across Christendom. He also expanded the Crusades into Spain and southern France. But the Fourth Crusade, launched under his leadership, went disastrously off course when the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, directly defying his orders. Honorius III, a Roman by birth, was beloved by the local people. He initiated the Fifth Crusade, securing support from the King of Hungary and the Holy Roman Emperor. During his time, Genghis Khan began the rapid expansion of the Mongol Empire, reshaping the future of Eurasia. Gregory IX, a cousin of Innocent III, led a smaller crusade to suppress a rebellion in Germany and launched the Sixth Crusade. This campaign saw Emperor Frederick II successfully reclaim Jerusalem. However, tensions escalated when Gregory declared open war on the emperor in what became known as the War of the Keys. Though the papal forces saw early victories, they were eventually defeated, forcing Gregory to enter into peace negotiations. Celestine IV was elected after one of the most grueling and contested papal elections in history. With Emperor Frederick besieging Rome, the cardinals were confined to a decaying building for weeks, enduring leaking rainwater, sewage, and severe food shortages. Conditions were so dire that one papal candidate died during the stalemate. When Celestine was finally elected, his frail health could not withstand the toll. He died just 17 days later, making his reign the third shortest in papal history. Innocent IV was elected after a year and a half without a pope, the longest papal vacancy up to that point. Unable to resolve tensions with Emperor Frederick, Innocent fled Rome and only returned after the emperor's death. During his papacy, he approved a crusade against pagan groups in Lithuania and Prussia and attempted to negotiate with the Mongol Empire, which had already conquered much of Eastern Europe and Asia. Alexander IV continued efforts to reconcile with the Eastern Orthodox Church. He established inquisitions in France and tried to organize a crusade to counter the Mongol invasion of Poland, at a time when the Mongol Empire had become the largest in the world and the second largest in recorded history. Urban IV witnessed the fall of the Latin Empire of Constantinople, originally established during the Fourth Crusade. He waged war against Manfred, King of Sicily, and the son of the late Emperor Frederick II, who had long defied papal authority. Urban also commissioned the philosopher Thomas Aquinas to write texts for the Mass, an important moment in church intellectual history. Clement IV aligned with Charles of Anjou, the youngest brother of the King of France, who defeated Manfred and became King of Sicily. Clement worked closely with Thomas Aquinas to establish educational institutions for the study of philosophy and opened diplomatic channels with the Mongols in an attempt to form a political alliance. Gregory X was elected after a nearly 3-year vacancy, the longest papal election in church history. At the time, he was in the Holy Land overseeing the Ninth Crusade. Upon returning to Italy, he engaged in communication with Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, in hopes of building East-West cooperation. The young explorer Marco Polo played a key role in delivering messages between Europe and the Mongol court. Innocent V was the first pope elected under the newly established papal conclave system. introduced by his predecessor to prevent the chaos of earlier elections. From this point forward, cardinals would be locked inside a building with restricted supplies to minimize external influence during the voting process. Innocent attempted to reunite with the Eastern Church, but his papacy lasted only 5 months before his death. Adrian V served even less time, only 38 days, and died before being ordained as a priest. Prior to his election, he was respected for mediating disputes between the English king and his barons. Ironically, one of his final acts as pope was to suspend the newly implemented conclave system, which remained inactive for several elections that followed. John XXI, the first and only Portuguese pope, tried to launch a new crusade for the Holy Land and sought to heal the rift with the Eastern Church. But his reign ended suddenly, after only 5 months, when the ceiling of his apartment collapsed, fatally injuring him. Nicholas III, the fourth pope from the influential Orsini family, worked to strengthen the papacy's position in Italy. However, he was widely criticized for nepotism, appointing several family members to powerful church roles. Contemporary writer Dante Alighieri famously placed him in the 8th circle of hell in his Inferno for corruption. Martin IV was the last French pope to rule from Rome and had participated in multiple conclaves before his own election. His decision to excommunicate the Eastern Roman Emperor deepened the division between East and West. During his pontificate, the Sicilian people overthrew King Charles, and Martin died shortly afterward from an unknown illness. Honorius IV, born in Rome and unanimously elected, was deeply admired by the Roman people. He faced a turbulent succession crisis over the throne of Sicily and received offers of military aid from the Mongols to expel Muslims from the Holy Land. However, he was unable to organize a crusading force and died soon after taking office. Nicholas IV became the first Franciscan pope, representing the order founded by Saint Francis of Assisi. He became involved in the political conflict in Sicily, crowning Charles II as king, and also made efforts to launch another crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. Celestine V was elected after a 2-year vacancy caused by a deadlock among the cardinals. A humble hermit with no political experience, Celestine struggled to govern effectively, and most of his decisions were later reversed. However, his most enduring legacy was establishing the right of a pope to resign, a right he exercised after just 5 months in office. Hoping to return to his solitary life, he was imprisoned by his successor and died in captivity. Boniface VIII asserted perhaps the boldest claims of papal authority in medieval history. He intervened in the affairs of France, Italy, Sicily, and tried to halt England's invasion of Scotland. His overreach brought him into direct conflict with European monarchs. King Philip IV of France eventually sent troops to attack Boniface at his residence, and the Pope died shortly after the assault. Benedict XI succeeded him, chosen in part for his perceived ability to restore relations with King Philip. He managed to broker an armistice between Philip and King Edward I of England, but his pontificate lasted only 8 months. His sudden death led to suspicions of poisoning. Clement V, a Frenchman, relocated the papacy from Rome to Avignon, beginning a 70-year period where 7 consecutive popes would rule from France. This era, known as the Avignon papacy, became infamous for corruption and its close alignment with French royal interests, which alienated England and other powers. Clement also oversaw the brutal suppression of the Knights Templar, who had fallen into disfavor and were accused of heresy and immorality. He launched another campaign for the Holy Land, known as the Crusade of the Poor, which failed to reach Jerusalem and only resulted in the capture of the Byzantine city of Rhodes. John XXII, who reigned for 18 years, the longest of the Avignon popes, opposed Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV, who invaded Italy and installed an anti-pope. John canonized Thomas Aquinas and declared that witchcraft would henceforth be punished as heresy after a failed assassination attempt involving poison and sorcery. Benedict XII introduced reforms to limit nepotism within the church, though the practice persisted for centuries. He also attempted to repair relations with Emperor Louis IV, but with little success. Despite being French himself, Benedict's relationship with King Philip of France remained strained. During his pontificate, tensions escalated between France and England, setting the stage for what would become the 100 Years' War. Clement VI was pope when the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, swept across Europe, killing nearly half the population and plunging the continent into chaos. As panic spread, Jews were widely blamed for the plague, leading to mass persecutions. An estimated 50,000 were executed, with thousands burned alive. Clement took a strong moral stance, publicly rejecting these accusations and ordering the clergy to protect Jewish communities from violence. He also launched a crusade to suppress Turkish piracy in the Aegean Sea and officially purchased the city of Avignon, adding it to the Papal States. Innocent VI followed with efforts to reassert papal authority. He abolished a prior agreement that had declared cardinals superior to the Pope, restoring hierarchical control. Innocent repaired relations with Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV and played a key role in brokering the treaty that ended the first phase of the 100 Years' War between England and France. He declined a proposal to reunify the Orthodox and Roman churches and faced severe financial strain following the plague, even resorting to selling church artwork to fund ongoing wars in Italy. Urban V was known for his personal humility and lived modestly despite his position. He focused on rebuilding churches and monasteries across Europe and continued efforts to bridge the divide between the Eastern and Western churches, though with little success. He also launched a crusade that captured the Egyptian city of Alexandria and sanctioned campaigns against the rising Ottoman Turks, who had begun overtaking large portions of the Byzantine Empire and would later capture Constantinople. Gregory XI, the last of the Avignon popes, returned the papacy to Rome after nearly 70 years of French control. He attempted to negotiate peace between the kings of England and France in the midst of the 100 Years' War, but failed. Upon his return to Italy, he declared war on a coalition of rebellious city-states led by Florence, in what became known as the War of the Eight Saints. The conflict only ended following Gregory's death. Urban VI inherited one of the most chaotic and divisive periods in the history of the papacy. His predecessor's decision to move the papacy back to Rome sparked the Western Schism, a nearly 40-year crisis that split the Catholic Church. In response, a group of French cardinals elected anti-Pope Clement VII, who re-established a rival papal court in Avignon. Clement excommunicated Urban, calling him the Antichrist. Urban, in turn, was eventually forced to flee Rome and died after sustaining injuries from falling off his mule. Boniface IX continued as pope in Rome during the height of the Western Schism, while the Avignon faction supported first Clement VII and later Benedict XIII. With Europe divided, nations and clergy were forced to choose between rival popes, deepening the fracture within the Church. Innocent VII succeeded Boniface in Rome, but contributed further to instability by appointing his unqualified nephew as commander of the papal militia. That decision proved disastrous when the nephew ordered the brutal murder of 11 political opponents, triggering widespread violence in the city. Gregory XII inherited the schism and saw it reach an even more confusing stage. The Council of Pisa was convened in an attempt to end the division by deposing both Gregory in Rome and Benedict XIII in Avignon. However, neither pope attended nor accepted the ruling. The council proceeded to elect a third pope, Alexander V, who set up his papal seat in Pisa. Alexander's death, he was succeeded by John XXIII, meaning the Church now had three claimants to the papacy simultaneously. The Council of Constance was eventually called to resolve the crisis once and for all. Gregory XII agreed to resign voluntarily. John XXIII was deposed, and Benedict XIII was excommunicated. The Catholic Church officially recognizes Gregory XII as the legitimate pope, with the other two considered anti-popes. Martin V was elected by the Council of Constance, bringing an end to the Western Schism. He returned the papacy to Rome, and re-established order after decades of division. Martin denounced the enslavement of Christians by Muslim powers, yet paradoxically supported Portuguese colonization efforts and the early enslavement of non-Christian Africans. It was during this time that Joan of Arc, who had led French forces to key victories in the 100 Years' War, was captured by the English and burned at the stake at the age of 19. Eugene IV, nephew of former Pope Gregory XII, succeeded Martin. He became involved in disputes between the Spanish and Portuguese crowns, who had begun building large ocean-going vessels and colonizing the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa. Eugene forbade the enslavement of Africans who had converted to Christianity, but authorized the Portuguese to enslave non-converted Africans, decisions that would shape the early dynamics of European colonial expansion. Nicholas V presided over one of the most pivotal turning points in world history, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the advancing Ottoman Turks. The loss marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and transformed the city into the capital of the growing Ottoman Empire. At the same time, the 100 Years' War between England and France had just drawn to a close, reshaping the political landscape of Europe. Nicholas also succeeded in convincing anti-Pope Felix V to step down, officially ending the long and divisive era of anti-popes. Under his leadership, Rome saw a flourishing of architecture and culture as the Renaissance reached new heights. He laid the groundwork for what would become the most iconic church in the world, the new St. Peter's Basilica. But his reign was also marked by moral contradiction. Nicholas authorized Portugal to enslave Africans, giving them the green light to challenge Muslim dominance over the trans-Saharan slave trade. Calixtus III, from the notorious Borgia family known for corruption and intrigue, followed Nicholas. He was an ardent crusader against the Ottomans, launching a military campaign that successfully halted their advance into Hungary. It was during his reign that the church began the tradition of ringing church bells at noon, a practice still alive today, to encourage prayer for the success of Christian armies. Calixtus also ordered the posthumous trial of Joan of Arc, clearing her name years after her execution. Pius II, a skilled diplomat and writer, became the first pope to author an autobiography. He continued to call for crusades against the Ottomans and took a special interest in Eastern Europe. He supported the efforts of Vlad the Impaler, later known as Dracula, whose brutal resistance against the Turks included the shocking impalement of over 20,000 enemy soldiers along a 60-mile stretch of road, and a near assassination of the Sultan himself. Paul II, the nephew of Pope Eugene IV, was a secretive and eccentric leader. He was known for bypassing traditional processes by appointing cardinals in secret and arresting those who challenged him, making him a controversial figure within the church hierarchy. Then came Sixtus IV, a pope remembered both for his contributions to the arts and for his darker legacy. He commissioned the construction of the Sistine Chapel, named after him, and founded the Vatican Library, bringing artists like Botticelli to Rome and fueling the High Renaissance. But his reign was also marked by violence and political intrigue. He authorized the Spanish Inquisition and became embroiled in the Pazzi conspiracy, an attempt to overthrow the powerful Medici family that ruled Florence. The plot failed, but it left a bloody mark on both church and state. Innocent VI strengthened the church's stance against witchcraft and found himself entangled in Ottoman politics. He accepted custody of the Sultan's rival brother, at a price. The Sultan paid Innocent handsomely to keep his brother imprisoned, and the Pope reportedly used the man as leverage, threatening to release him if the Ottomans dared invade the Balkans. Meanwhile, the Spanish king gifted the Pope 100 captured Muslim slaves. Innocent divided them among his cardinals, an unsettling example of the church's entanglement with the darker politics of power. Then came Alexander VI, one of the most infamous figures to ever sit on the papal throne. The second Borgia Pope, he was defined by scandal, nepotism, and corruption. Openly admitting to fathering up to 10 children with his mistresses, Alexander used the papacy to elevate his family. But his influence extended far beyond Rome. When Christopher Columbus opened the gates to the New World, it was Alexander who drew a line across the map, giving nearly all of the Americas to Spain, while reserving Africa and Asia for Portuguese expansion. This boundary would later be formalized in the Treaty of Tordesillas, a striking example of just how powerful the papacy remained, able to divide the globe between empires with a stroke of a pen. Pius III followed briefly, hoping to ease tensions between Spain and France and restore calm to the Papal States. But his papacy was cut short. After surgery on his leg, he died of sepsis just 27 days in, one of the shortest papacies in history. Julius II was the polar opposite. Known as the warrior pope, he viewed himself more as a general than a priest, styling his rule after Julius Caesar. He expanded the Papal States through military campaigns during the Italian Wars and created a lasting legacy in the arts and in security. Julius hired the elite mercenaries of Switzerland to form his personal army, the Swiss Guard. With bright uniforms based on the Medici colors, they still serve as protectors of the Vatican to this day. Julius also began construction on the magnificent new St. Peter's Basilica and commissioned legendary works like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling and Raphael's The School of Athens. Under his command, the Renaissance flourished. Then came Leo X, the first pope from the powerful Medici banking dynasty. Elected at just 37, Leo poured church resources into politics, waging expensive wars to place his nephew in power and plunging the papacy deep into debt. But it was his approval of indulgences, selling forgiveness for sin in exchange for money, that would have world-changing consequences. These indulgences helped fund Vatican art and architecture, but they also sparked outrage. A German monk named Martin Luther would soon rise in protest, igniting what became the Protestant Reformation. Leo X's papacy was a glittering pageant of wealth and power, and according to some, one of dangerous complacency. And yes, he also had a pet elephant named Hanno, gifted by the King of Portugal. The animal became a symbol of Leo's extravagance and the bizarre splendor of Renaissance Rome. Adrian VI was the first and only Dutch pope. And after him, for nearly 450 years, the papacy would be held exclusively by Italians. But Adrian's short reign was marked by one of the greatest crises in church history, the Protestant Reformation. Sparked by Martin Luther's 95 Theses, the movement condemned papal corruption and even labeled the Pope the Antichrist. Adrian declared Luther a heretic and made attempts at internal reform, but the damage was already spreading. His reign lasted just over a year and a half, and by that time, the world's Christian population had reached an estimated 100 million, fractured and dividing. Clement VII, the second Medici pope, is often called the unluckiest pope in history. His reign fell into chaos. The Reformation surged. Church coffers ran dry. The Ottoman Empire reached its height and pushed into Eastern Europe. Then came catastrophe. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, invaded the Papal States. The sack of Rome in 1527 followed, one of the most devastating events in the city's history. Thousands were massacred. Famine and plague swept through. Rome's population plummeted by 80%. The Swiss Guard was decimated, and Clement himself was imprisoned. With that, the golden age of the Italian Renaissance effectively ended. Clement's troubles didn't stop there. He refused King Henry XIII's request for a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, who happened to be the emperor's aunt. That refusal drove England to permanently sever ties with the Catholic Church, founding the Church of England. Yet, despite all this, Clement still managed to leave a legacy in the arts. He commissioned work from Raphael, Sebastiano del Piombo, and Michelangelo. Most notably, he endorsed Copernicus's radical theory that the Earth revolved around the sun, an idea that would upend centuries of belief. Paul III followed in the aftermath of ruin. He became the first major pope of the Counter-Reformation, initiating the Council of Trent to combat corruption and restore spiritual discipline. Under Paul, the Church began to fight back against Protestantism. He allied with the Holy Roman Empire in wars against Protestant princes in Germany, but was also criticized for his own nepotism, appointing 2 teenage grandsons as cardinals and elevating his illegitimate son to duke. Still, Paul made a groundbreaking declaration. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were fully human and deserved freedom, dignity, and protection from exploitation. It was a radical stance, so radical that the Spanish crown forced him to retract it. Yet paradoxically, he also permitted the continued enslavement of Muslims within the Papal States, revealing the complicated and often contradictory moral compass of the time. Julius III showed little interest in leading the Church and preferred the luxury of his private villa, where he spent much of his time indulging in personal pleasures. He briefly assisted Queen Mary Warnes of England in restoring Catholicism, undoing the reforms of her father, Henry VIII. But this revival was short-lived. Mary's successor, Elizabeth I, would return England to Protestantism. Julius's papacy was further marred by scandal. His unusually close relationship with his teenage adoptive nephew, whom he elevated to cardinal, fueled public suspicion and damaged the Church's already fragile reputation. Paul IV's papacy took a darker turn. He harbored a deep hatred for the Spanish Habsburgs, a feud that led to Spanish forces invading the Papal States and forcing him into an uneasy peace. Like many popes of the era, Paul appointed his nephew as cardinal, a common practice that gave rise to the very word nepotism. But Paul's reign was infamous for more than favoritism. His treatment of Protestants and Jewish converts was brutal. 25 were burned at the stake, and in Rome, he established the first official Jewish ghetto, enforcing strict segregation, distinctive clothing, and social exclusion. His distaste for Renaissance art also drew ire. Paul revoked Michelangelo's pension and demanded the master's famous nude frescoes in the Sistine Chapel be covered. Michelangelo refused. Paul even threatened to have the entire ceiling whitewashed. So despised was he that when he died, the people of Rome rioted, crowned his statue with a yellow Jewish hat, decapitated it, and hurled it into the Tiber River. Pius IV, the third Medici pope, brought calm after the storm. He pardoned the Roman rioters and ordered the arrest and execution of Paul IV's notoriously corrupt nephews. He presided over the final sessions of the Council of Trent, which aimed to reform church practices and curb abuses. Yet, like many before him, he couldn't resist promoting his own family, appointing 3 nephews as cardinals. After Michelangelo's death, Pius fulfilled his predecessor's controversial wishes, assigning one of the artist's friends to paint loincloths over much of the nudity in the Sistine Chapel. Centuries later, many of these coverings would be removed, restoring the artwork to its former glory. Gregory XIII would be remembered not for battles, but for something far more enduring: the calendar you're using today. The Gregorian calendar, named after him, fixed the leap year system and replaced Julius Caesar's ancient Julian calendar. In a bold move, Gregory ordered the calendar to jump from October 4th to October 15th, skipping 10 days entirely. Landlords protested the lost rent, but the reform endured. It would take centuries, but eventually, the whole world would adopt this system. Gregory also supported Catholic resistance abroad, encouraging Spain to depose Queen Elizabeth and even sending a ship of soldiers to aid Irish Catholics. The ship was intercepted, and everyone aboard, including women and children, was executed by the English. Leo XI, the last pope from the powerful Medici family, was elected at the age of 69 with support from French and Italian cardinals, much to the displeasure of Spain. But the cold winds during his coronation proved fatal. He fell ill and died after just 27 days in office, making his reign the 9th shortest in papal history. Paul V supported the revolutionary theories of Galileo, who built on Copernicus's heliocentric model that the Earth revolved around the Sun. Though controversial, Paul's openness to scientific discovery marked a complex chapter in the Church's relationship with science. He clashed with Venice over the limits of Church authority and struggled with strained relations with English Catholics. Still, he made one of the most lasting contributions to Catholic architecture, financing the completion of St. Peter's Basilica, now the symbolic heart of the Church. Gregory XV backed the Holy Roman Emperor and the Catholic League during the fierce wars against Protestant states and the Ottoman Empire. He founded the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith to oversee global missionary efforts, expanding Catholic influence from Europe to the farthest corners of the world. Gregory also issued the final official papal directive on witchcraft, signaling the Church's slow turn away from the persecutions of the past. Urban VIII's reign was long and turbulent. He expanded the Papal States through costly military campaigns that left the Vatican heavily in debt and weakened its future political clout. While he spoke out against slavery in South America, he also heavily favored his own family, an example of extreme nepotism that would be widely criticized. His time as Pope overlapped with the brutal 30 Years' War, which devastated much of Europe. Urban is also remembered for his role in the trial of Galileo. Though he had once supported him, Urban turned against Galileo after the astronomer's findings challenged church doctrine, resulting in Galileo's trial and lifelong house arrest. Alexander VII was elected with hopes that he would continue the reform-minded legacy of his predecessors, especially in eliminating nepotism. But just a year into his papacy, he appointed his own nephew as cardinal and filled his administration with family members, undermining the very ideals that brought him to power. Still, Alexander made lasting contributions to Rome's architecture and urban design. Politically, he sided with Spain during its ongoing conflict with Portugal, aligning the Church with the dominant Catholic power of the time. Innocent XI followed with a return to discipline and financial prudence. Known for his modesty and moral strength, he slashed taxes and brought the Church's budget back into balance. Innocent firmly opposed nepotism and gained widespread respect for his integrity. On the world stage, he formed the Holy League that successfully pushed back the Ottoman Empire's advance into Eastern Europe, liberating Austria and Hungary. Today, he is still honored in Hungary as a national hero. His relationship with France, however, was tense. When Louis XIV of France seized Avignon and challenged papal authority, Innocent stood firm. He also advocated better treatment for Jews in Venice, securing the release of prisoners, but his stance remained conflicted as he simultaneously banned moneylending by Jews in Rome, believing it exploited the poor. Alexander VIII marked a disappointing turn. After several reformist popes, his short reign saw a return to open nepotism. He used the office to enrich and elevate his family, reversing many of the hard-won financial reforms. Though elected with support from Louis XIV, who returned Avignon to the Church, Alexander's governance ultimately damaged the reputation of the papacy, once again clouding its spiritual mission with political and personal ambition. Leo XII ruled through constant pain and declining health. A staunch conservative, he became deeply unpopular for enforcing strict moral laws, threatening excommunication for dressmakers who didn't meet his standards of modesty. His treatment of Rome's Jewish population was even more severe. He banned them from owning property, reimposed segregation, and required visible marks of identification, driving many to flee the city. Despite his efforts at frugality, he failed to restore the Papal States' crumbling finances. Pius VIII reigned during a time of cautious progress. France underwent the July Revolution, while the UK passed the Catholic Emancipation Act, granting new freedoms to Catholics. Though reluctant, Pius allowed interfaith marriages between Catholics and Protestants, on the condition the children be raised Catholic. His fragile health limited his impact, and he died at age 69, after the shortest papacy of the 19th century. Gregory XVI took office just as liberal revolutions began spreading across Europe, fueled by the aftermath of Napoleon. But Gregory resisted modernization entirely. He opposed new technologies like gaslights and railroads, fearing they would empower political elites and weaken the Church's hold. His papacy saw Catholic influence in France decline with the fall of its monarchy. Yet Gregory did take a moral stand, publicly denouncing the transatlantic slave trade. And during his tenure, the Church finally ended its long-standing opposition to teaching that the earth revolves around the sun. Then came Pius IX, the first pope ever photographed, and the one who would endure the greatest loss of power in papal history. His reign began amid waves of nationalist uprisings. Italy, fractured for centuries, was now determined to unify, and the Papal States stood in the way. Pius refused to fight Austria after its annexation of northern Italy, and soon Rome itself turned against him. His own prime minister was assassinated, the Swiss Guard was disarmed, and the Pope was forced to flee. In his absence, the Roman Republic was born, declaring the end of papal political rule. But Pius fought back. He called on French forces under Napoleon III to retake the city. They crushed the Republic, and Pius returned, not to the Lateran Palace, but to the Vatican, where popes have remained ever since. But the tide couldn't be held back forever. A decade later, a unified Italian army of 60,000 overwhelmed the Pope's force of 10,000. Rome was captured, Italy was unified. The Kingdom of Italy was born, with Victor Emmanuel II as its king and Rome as its capital. After over 1,100 years, the Papal States were gone. Pius IX retreated within the Vatican's walls. He refused to recognize the new kingdom and famously declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican, a symbolic stance maintained by the next three popes. He died at age 85, after the longest verified papal reign since St. Peter himself. Leo XIII ushered in a new era, the first pope ever captured on film, and believed to be the earliest born person in history ever recorded on camera. With the Papal States now gone, he became the prototype for modern popes, no longer wielding political rule, but serving as a global moral voice. Though stripped of temporal power, Leo remained deeply influential, especially as the world changed rapidly around him. Known as the Pope of the Workers, he became a champion for labor rights. He spoke out for fair wages, safe working conditions, the right to own property, and the freedom to form trade unions. While he supported free enterprise, he fiercely condemned the rise of communism spreading through Europe. His encyclical Rerum Novarum would become a cornerstone of Catholic social teaching, shaping the Church's engagement with the modern world. A skilled diplomat, Leo helped mend strained ties with France, Britain, Germany, and Russia. He died at 93, the oldest verified pope in history, after the fourth longest papal reign ever recorded. Pius X followed with a deeply reform-minded spirit. He simplified church doctrine, promoted frequent communion, and took decisive steps against corruption within the clergy. After a catastrophic earthquake struck southern Italy, killing more than 80,000 people, Pius opened the doors of the Vatican to refugees, acting far quicker than the Italian government. Despite these humanitarian efforts, he remained unwavering in his protest against the Kingdom of Italy, refusing to acknowledge its legitimacy or leave Vatican grounds. Pius also had a historic meeting with Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism. He listened respectfully, but ultimately declined support for a Jewish state, citing the refusal to recognize Jesus as the Messiah. In the Philippines, following the U.S. acquisition of the islands, Pius negotiated a $7 million deal to sell off church lands, showing both pragmatism and resolve to protect Catholic interests abroad. Yet not all of his declarations were political. He famously condemned the tango as immoral and prohibited Catholics from dancing it, believing it to be a sign of moral decline. But beneath the conservative stances was a man of humility. He scaled back lavish ceremonies, rejected nepotism entirely, and allowed his closest relatives to live modestly in poverty near Rome. When he died at age 79, he was deeply loved by the faithful. By the time of his death, the global Christian population had grown to nearly 1 billion, a faith still standing, reshaped by the storms of history, and led now by popes who ruled not through crowns or armies, but through conscience and conviction. Benedict XV took the papal throne as the world descended into unprecedented horror. World War I. From the start, he declared the Church's strict neutrality, though critics often accused him of favoring Catholic France over mostly Protestant Germany. Still, Benedict was relentless in his pursuit of peace. Time and again, he offered to mediate between the warring nations, but all sides refused his hand. So he turned instead to mercy. While empires clashed, Benedict orchestrated massive humanitarian efforts, rescuing civilians, organizing exchanges of prisoners, and delivering food to starving populations across Europe. Tens of thousands owed their lives to his behind-the-scenes interventions. He sent aid to victims of famine in post-revolutionary Russia and spoke out against the growing persecution of Catholics under Soviet rule. After the war, Benedict focused on healing. He mended the long-fraught relationship with France and cautiously improved ties with Italy. Although, like the popes before him, he still refused to leave the Vatican or acknowledge the Italian kingdom's legitimacy. Yet, on the global stage, his influence expanded. He became the first pope to meet a U.S. president, welcoming Woodrow Wilson with hope for a more peaceful world. In one of his more surprising positions, Benedict openly supported the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. He called the Jewish return to the Holy Land the will of God, a rare and bold stance for his time. But despite his hopes for lasting peace, he foresaw danger. He believed the Treaty of Versailles had punished Germany too severely, and warned that another war was almost certain to follow. He would not live to see it, but his warning would soon echo through history. Pius XI stepped into a world teetering toward catastrophe. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had seized power, and he knew that to solidify his rule, he needed the Church. So, an agreement was struck. For the first time in modern history, the Vatican became an independent nation, just 44 hectares tucked inside Rome, with the Pope as its sovereign. In return, the Holy See officially relinquished all claims to the once sprawling Papal States and formally recognized the Kingdom of Italy. But the deal stopped there. The Pope owed Mussolini no loyalty. The Vatican received compensation equivalent to $100 million for church property it had lost. Pius invested the funds strategically, placing them in U.S. real estate and the stock market, moves that would dramatically strengthen the Church's financial footing. He also broke a long-standing silence. Pius became the first pope in 60 years to leave the Vatican walls, refusing to remain a symbolic prisoner of the past. As Hitler rose in Germany, Pius saw the danger. He fiercely condemned the Nazi regime, denouncing its racial ideologies as fundamentally un-Christian. When Hitler sent him a congratulatory telegram on the anniversary of his coronation, the Pope's reply was scathing. His foreign secretary, fearful of the consequences, hesitated to deliver it. But Pius insisted. "There is only one human race," he declared again and again. He rejected the Nazi idea of racial superiority and stood firmly for the dignity of every person. He quietly supported Catholic missionaries in the United States who worked with Native and African Americans, emphasizing that Christian care must extend to all. Socially conservative, Pius also wrote on the role of the family, urging that fathers earn enough so mothers could stay home, a belief he called central to the moral fabric of society. He championed tradition, yet embraced innovation. He launched Vatican Radio, becoming the first pope to speak to the world through the airwaves, and he loved it. In 1939, Pius XI suffered 2 heart attacks. As his body weakened, those around him heard his final words, softly spoken, but full of meaning. Peace, peace. Pius XII remains one of the most debated popes in history, praised by some, condemned by others, for how he navigated the darkest years of the 20th century, World War II. Before he became pope, Eugenio Pacelli had served as the Vatican's representative in Germany. He later returned to Rome and became Secretary of State, where he negotiated a concordat with Nazi Germany, intended to protect the rights of the Catholic Church. But that agreement was repeatedly violated as Hitler's regime escalated religious persecution. Pius XII was chosen in part for his deep familiarity with Germany. When the war began, the Vatican officially declared neutrality. Yet behind the scenes, Pius turned the Vatican into a hub of humanitarian aid, helping prisoners of war, sheltering refugees, and processing more than 10 million requests to reunite missing families. He sympathized with the German people, but not their rulers. He quietly supported the Allies, especially the United States, where much of the Vatican's wealth had been invested. After the invasion of Poland by Germany and the Soviet Union, he denounced anti-Semitism, totalitarianism, and the madness of war, calling instead for human dignity and peace. He provided crucial intelligence to the Allies, actions that enraged Mussolini. When a German official asked why the Vatican appeared to side with the Allies, Pius simply listed the atrocities the Nazis had committed. He tried, unsuccessfully, to dissuade Mussolini from joining the Axis. And when the Nazis occupied Italy and Rome, plans were drafted to kidnap the Pope. They were never carried out. In secret, Pius sheltered over 5,000 Roman Jews inside the Vatican and his summer residence at Castel Gandolfo. He gave jobs to Jewish scholars who had been expelled by fascist laws. Hitler's own biographer would later write that the Catholic Church, under Pius, saved more Jews than any other institution during the war. Privately, the Pope described Hitler as a fundamentally wicked man and likened him to Lucifer. Yet critics, even among the Allies, believed he should have done more. They faulted his silence, his refusal to name Hitler directly or take a louder public stance. Defenders argue the Pope was surrounded by enemies, in a city occupied by the Nazis with no army to protect him or his people. In such a fragile position, words alone could have spelled disaster. What Pius did do was excommunicate members of the Italian Communist Party, calling the ideological war against communism a spiritual battle, a holy war. The world would never see another war like it. And the Church would never forget the Pope, who walked a tightrope between silence and survival. Much of the early criticism leveled at Pius XII has since been traced to communist sources, part of a deliberate campaign to undermine both the Pope and Western Catholicism. Pius was an outspoken opponent of communism, calling it a grave threat to faith and human dignity. In 2020, Pope Francis opened millions of pages of Vatican archives from World War II, finally allowing scholars to examine Pius XII's actions in full. What emerged was a more complex legacy. It's been confirmed that Pius personally intervened to save at least 15,000 Jews from extermination, sheltering many inside church properties. He even sent a report of Nazi atrocities to the US government, but was reportedly met with disbelief. The documents also revealed that early in his papacy, Pius engaged in secret negotiations with Hitler, attempting to secure protections for the Church in Germany. No formal agreement was ever reached, but this detail further complicated his image. One of the more painful revelations was Pius's involvement in a scandal after the war. Some Jewish children who had been secretly baptized during the Holocaust were kept from their surviving families, raised as Catholics, sometimes against the relatives' wishes. Pius, it seems, believed he was protecting their souls, though many now view it as a grave overreach. On other fronts, Pius accepted scientific advancements. He acknowledged that evolution could explain the development of human life, though he insisted the soul was divinely created by God. After the war, Italy voted to abolish its monarchy due to its collaboration with fascism. Though Pius had privately criticized the king, he admitted he would have preferred Italy remain a monarchy. He feared that, without it, the country might drift further into secularism, a path that could distance it from the Church, which itself resembles a monarchy in structure and tradition. To this day, Pius XII remains a deeply polarizing figure. His critics point to what they see as silence in the face of evil, but his defenders argue that he was unjustly vilified, acting with prudence under impossible circumstances. Among those who praised him were Jewish survivors, Albert Einstein, and even several Israeli prime ministers, who credited the Pope with saving lives when few others would. History, it seems, continues to weigh his silence against the shadows he helped disperse. Before he became Pope, John the 23rd had already shown remarkable courage. As a bishop in Hungary during World War II, he worked quietly but effectively to help save Jewish lives, intervening where he could, and expressing sympathy for Jewish immigration to Palestine, which he viewed as a humanitarian need rather than a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Then came the papal conclave that would change history and spark one of its enduring mysteries. At one point, white smoke rose from the Vatican chimney, signaling a successful election. But confusion followed. Black smoke soon replaced it, suggesting no decision had been reached. When John the 23rd was finally announced as Pope, some speculated that another man had first been elected. Perhaps someone who declined, was pressured to resign, or whose selection was invalidated. Others point to a simple chemical misfire in the smoke mix. Whatever the truth, the moment remains shrouded in speculation. As Pope, John the 23rd quickly became a bridge builder. He sought to heal old wounds between the Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, and appointed the first cardinals from Africa, Japan, and the Philippines, pushing the Church toward global inclusivity. He showed deep personal respect for the Jewish people, though the Vatican itself still did not recognize the State of Israel, a recognition that would not come until 1993. Known for his humility, John once received a lavish papal tiara adorned with precious jewels. He quietly ordered half the gems removed and sold, with the money given to the poor. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he served as an intermediary between President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev, calling for peace. Both leaders praised his efforts, and that year, Time magazine named him Man of the Year, a first for a pope. John died of stomach cancer at the age of 81 and was later canonized as a saint, but his legacy, like many before him, carries a shadow. In 2003, The Guardian revealed a confidential 69-page Vatican document bearing John the 23rd's seal. It instructed bishops to cover up cases of clerical abuse, warning that disclosure could lead to excommunication. Whether he was fully aware of its implications or merely continued long-standing policies remains unclear, but it was a decision that would haunt the Church for decades to come. Saint or sinner, reformer or institution man, John the 23rd story remains a mirror, reflecting both the light and darkness within the walls of the Vatican. Paul VI was a natural choice for the papacy, well-liked, deeply respected, and closely connected with his two immediate predecessors. Once elected, he began quietly dismantling centuries of pomp and ceremony. He sold the papal crown itself and gave the proceeds to the poor, signaling a new humility at the heart of the Vatican. But his true legacy was transformation. Paul VI completed the Second Vatican Council, the bold and controversial initiative that had begun under John the 23rd. It would be called the most significant reform to the Church in 4 centuries, modernizing the liturgy, encouraging dialogue with other faiths, and opening new windows to the modern world. He reached across divides, improving relations with both the Eastern Orthodox and Protestant churches. Paul VI was also a man of global reach. He became the first pope to board an airplane, eventually visiting every continent except Antarctica, earning the title the Pilgrim Pope. When he addressed the United Nations in New York, his voice trembled with urgency, pleading for peace in war-torn Vietnam. In the Philippines, he narrowly survived an attempted stabbing, an attack foiled just in time. He was twice denied entry into Poland by its communist government, but he persisted in his support for religious freedom. When Apollo 11 landed on the moon, Paul VI's message was among those carried there, a tiny metal disc engraved with the words of world leaders. It remains on the lunar surface today, a symbol of the Church's presence, even in the heavens. Paul VI died of a heart attack at age 80 and was later declared a saint. His papacy had not been easy, but it changed the Church forever. His successor, John Paul I, brought a warmth and gentleness that instantly endeared him to the world. As a cardinal, he had quietly sold a gold cross that once belonged to Pius XII and used the funds to help disabled children. He called on priests to do the same, to shed luxury and embrace simplicity. When elected pope, he broke tradition by choosing two names, honoring John XXIII and Paul VI. Then, he broke even more. He was the first to reject the grand papal coronation, opting instead for a humble inauguration. He permanently retired the papal tiara, ending over 1,000 years of crown-bearing papacy. John Paul I's humility was revolutionary, but tragically, his reign was short. Just 33 days after his election, at age 65, he was found dead in his room, a book in hand, the light still on. He had complained of chest pains the night before. Officially, it was a heart attack, but for many, his sudden death felt like a silence that came too soon, gentle, unresolved, and filled with questions. John Paul II was elected at just 58, the first Polish pope, and the first non-Italian to wear the white robes in over 450 years since Adrian VI. His election was a turning point. Charismatic, courageous, and deeply human, he would become one of the most consequential popes in modern history. He traveled farther than any pope before him, visiting 129 countries, embracing the faithful across continents. Under his leadership, the Catholic Church expanded dramatically in Africa and Latin America, and the global Christian population soared past 2 billion, with over 1 billion Catholics. In the Philippines, he drew one of the largest crowds in human history. Over 6 million people gathered to see him. John Paul II was a bridge builder. He was the first pope to meet a sitting U.S. president at the White House and the first to meet a British monarch since the Reformation. He prayed at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, stepped inside synagogues, and became the first pope to enter a mosque, where he controversially kissed the Quran in a gesture of peace. He refused to visit apartheid-era South Africa, firmly denouncing the regime. He was also unafraid to speak out. When the U.S. invaded Iraq, he called it a defeat for humanity, earning him a Nobel Peace Prize nomination. He stood before the mafia in southern Italy and publicly condemned their terror. Soon after, 2 historic churches in Rome were bombed in retaliation. But perhaps his most enduring legacy was in the fall of communism. He inspired revolutions of spirit across Eastern Europe. His home country of Poland was first, and then the rest followed. President Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev both credited him as instrumental in ending the Cold War. Gorbachev later said, "Without him, the Iron Curtain would not have fallen." Communist regimes tried to silence him with lies, fabricated scandals, drugged witnesses, fake children, but the plots unraveled, and John Paul only became more beloved. He sought healing for a divided church, becoming the first pope in 1,000 years to visit Eastern Orthodox nations like Romania, Ukraine, and Greece. He also visited a Lutheran church, symbolically extending a hand across centuries of division. He strengthened ties with the Jewish people, having grown up alongside them in Poland, and even saved lives during the Holocaust, an act for which Israel later honored him. Under his guidance, the Vatican officially recognized the State of Israel. He canonized more saints than any other pope in history, over 1,800, reviving the stories of ordinary people made extraordinary by faith. In 1981, while in St. Peter's Square, he was shot twice at close range. He lost nearly 3/4 of his blood, but survived. The gunman was part of a fascist extremist group. He was captured by a nun and imprisoned. Years later, John Paul II visited him in prison and forgave him. The man was later released at the Pope's request and deported to Turkey to finish serving time for earlier crimes. John Paul II didn't just lead the church, he reshaped it. He was a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of resilience, and a bridge between worlds once divided. His papacy marked the beginning of a truly global church. Despite surviving the 1981 assassination attempt, John Paul II remained a marked man. His personal secretary later revealed that the Pope privately believed the Soviet Union was behind the attack, a suspicion echoed by multiple independent investigations. Exactly 1 year later, a second attacker lunged at him with a bayonet. This time, it was a Spanish Catholic priest. His motive? Hatred of the reforms introduced by the Second Vatican Council. The priest served just half of a 6-year sentence. But the most chilling plot came in 1995. Al-Qaeda operatives planned to assassinate the Pope in the Philippines by posing as priests and detonating a bomb as he passed through a crowd. It was only by chance, after a chemical fire broke out in their apartment, that police discovered and foiled the plot. And the Pope was only stage 1. The next phases of the plan were even more horrific. Bomb 11 airliners and crash another into CIA headquarters. This would later be seen as a chilling precursor to 9/11. Through it all, John Paul remained steady. He was the first pope to publicly apologize for the Church's role in major historical wrongs. The condemnation of Galileo, the Inquisition, complicity in the Atlantic slave trade, injustices against women, and its silence during the Holocaust. These apologies were historic, and they resonated far beyond Catholicism. But his final years were not without controversy. Under his papacy, the Church was rocked by its deepest scandal in centuries, the global child abuse crisis. For years, survivors spoke out, ignored, silenced, and dismissed. The Vatican's responses were slow, secretive, and often amounted to quiet transfers instead of justice. It wasn't until 2002, after mounting public pressure, that John Paul implemented reforms, mandatory background checks, cooperation with law enforcement, and the end of internal-only investigations. For many, it was too late. Critics argued he had protected the institution at the cost of the innocent. Others pointed to his age and failing health and claimed he was shielded from the full extent of what was happening beneath him. But the damage was done, and the scars remain. After 26 years on the throne of Peter, the third longest reign in papal history, John Paul II died at age 84. He had lived through an assassination attempt, Parkinson's disease, and decades of global travel. His funeral brought the world together. 4 kings, 5 queens, 80 heads of state, and leaders from every major religion stood in St. Peter's Square to honor the man who had once been a factory worker from Poland. He would later be canonized, becoming St. John Paul II. And for many, especially those who remember his towering presence on the world stage, he will always be remembered as John Paul the Great. Benedict XVI never wanted the throne. Even as a cardinal, he tried to resign 3 times due to declining health, but Pope John Paul II refused each request. When John Paul died, the College of Cardinals turned to the one man who had been his closest theological advisor. At 78, Joseph Ratzinger became Pope Benedict XVI, naming himself after Benedict XV, who had guided the Church through World War I. Almost immediately, controversy followed. In a 2006 speech, he quoted a 14th century text that described the Prophet Muhammad as spreading Islam by the sword. Though Benedict clarified and apologized, the backlash was intense. Muslim leaders condemned the remarks, and protests erupted during his visit to Turkey, requiring unprecedented levels of security. Yet Benedict remained active. He traveled extensively, visiting the United States, addressing the United Nations, and even personally meeting with abuse survivors in Australia, where he issued a public apology. He championed diplomacy over conflict, encouraged the peaceful use of nuclear energy, and called for restraint in escalating tensions with North Korea. On Christmas Eve in St. Peter's Basilica, a woman jumped the barricade and pulled him to the ground. At 82 years old, Benedict was shaken but unharmed. He forgave her and continued the Mass, while another cardinal who fell broke his hip. Known as a brilliant theologian, Benedict wrote 66 books, recorded a music album, and became the first pope to launch a Twitter account. But perhaps his most defining legacy began long before he wore the white robe. As head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, he had taken on what many wouldn't: the growing crisis of clerical abuse. He updated canon law, streamlined the removal of abusers, and handed cases over to civil authorities. He was determined to clean house, even removing a powerful Austrian cardinal who had once been close to John Paul II. His approach was methodical, serious, and, according to many insiders, unpopular within the Vatican itself. But he wasn't without criticism. Some accused him of being too slow, too lenient in certain cases, especially regarding priests in Germany when he was archbishop. In a few instances, abusers were quietly transferred, continuing their crimes elsewhere. The contradictions between his efforts and his missteps would follow him for the rest of his life. Then, in 2013, the world was stunned. For the first time in nearly 600 years, a pope voluntarily resigned. At almost 86, Benedict cited his frailty and said he no longer had the strength to lead the church. From that moment on, he held the title Pope Emeritus, a living former pope who stepped aside not in disgrace, but in humility. He spent his final years writing, praying, and quietly supporting his successor, Pope Francis. When he passed away in 2022, he was 95 years old, the oldest verified pope in history. Though his papacy ended nearly a decade before his death, his legacy continues to spark debate. Pope Francis, born in Argentina to Italian immigrants, is the first pontiff from the Americas and the Southern Hemisphere. Elevated to cardinal by Pope John Paul II, he was seen as a popular successor to Benedict XVI, though he had long expressed a desire to retire. Elected at age 76, Francis chose a name never before used: Francis, in honor of Saint Francis of Assisi. He also became the first Jesuit pope, representing a powerful and sometimes controversial Catholic order. Especially influential in South America and often at odds with European monarchies, he rejected the traditional papal gold cross, choosing instead to keep his simple iron one. Upon assuming office, he eliminated many Vatican staff bonuses, redirecting millions to charitable causes. He also launched a sweeping reform of the Vatican Bank, long plagued by allegations of corruption and money laundering, replacing most of its leadership and pledging to shut it down entirely if transparency could not be achieved. Seen as the most progressive pope in modern history, Francis has drawn both praise and criticism. Supporters see him as a much-needed reformer in a stagnant institution, while critics, especially traditionalists, have accused him of straying too far from church doctrine. He has called for the worldwide abolition of the death penalty, condemned economic exploitation, and championed higher taxes on the wealthy. He appointed women to roles traditionally held by men and expressed support for universal basic income. On climate change, he has denounced environmental destruction as a sin and urged global accountability. His early papacy faced backlash for appearing too lenient on clergy accused of abuse. He later acknowledged these failures, issued public apologies, and oversaw internal investigations that also faulted his two predecessors for inaction. Francis has also taken a more inclusive stance toward the LGBT community, famously stating, "Who am I to judge?" While still upholding the traditional definition of marriage, he supports the legal recognition of civil unions and has called for the decriminalization of homosexuality. A vocal advocate for refugees and migrants, Francis's own father fled Mussolini's Italy. His global diplomacy included a controversial agreement with China, allowing the Chinese government input on appointing bishops in exchange for its recognition of the Pope's authority. Though frequently violated by China, Francis has defended the deal as a step toward continued dialogue. Despite the agreement with China, tensions remain high. The Vatican is one of only 12 states that still recognize Taiwan, while China does not acknowledge Vatican City as a sovereign nation. Beijing has repeatedly violated the bishop agreement, appointing clergy without papal consent. But Francis continues to defend the deal, insisting that imperfect dialogue is still better than silence. He has openly condemned the persecution of China's Uyghur population, calling them one of the world's most oppressed peoples. His diplomatic outreach also extended to Cuba, where he met with Raúl Castro and played a key role in restoring U.S.-Cuban relations under President Barack Obama. Francis visited both Israel and the Palestinian territories, meeting with their leaders, and later hosted Mahmoud Abbas at the Vatican, officially recognizing the State of Palestine. He has continually called for peace, ceasefires, and a two-state solution, while also denouncing violence on both sides. In the war between Russia and Ukraine, he has dispatched envoys to encourage peace, but has drawn criticism for not explicitly condemning Russia's aggression. In 2013, 2014, and 2015, Forbes named Francis the fourth most powerful person in the world. He became the first pope to join Instagram, setting a record with over 1 million followers in just 12 hours. Though reportedly healthy upon his election, Francis has faced health struggles in recent years. At 88, he was hospitalized in early 2025 with severe bronchitis and early kidney failure, remaining in critical condition for 5 weeks before returning to the Vatican. He has stated he has not considered resignation, but would step down if his health made him unable to lead, suggesting that, like Benedict XVI, retirement may become part of the evolving role of the modern papacy. As of now, Pope Francis has passed away, leaving behind a deep sense of sorrow among millions around the world. Though some of his decisions stirred debate, his compassion, reformist spirit, and vision for a more human-centered church remain undeniable. Now all eyes turn to the Vatican. We can only hope that the next pope will carry forward the flame of mercy, leading the church and humanity toward a future shaped by faith, justice, and love.